Week 7 of the 2024 fantasy football season is here, and we need to break down every single quarterback and every single tight end for every single matchup of Week 7 of the season and talk about who you should be starting and who you should be sitting. And before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 7 NFL Pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free Bo Nix over half of a total yard pick'em to use towards Thursday night's action. And don't worry, if you guys watch this video later in the week, you're still going to get a free pick'em to use towards Sunday's slate of games. And on top of that, Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free pick'em for the week and up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. All right, very quickly, we've got just two teams on bye weeks here in Week 7, the Bears and the Cowboys. So we'll be without Caleb Williams and Cole Kmet, both coming off of big performances. And we'll be without Dak Prescott and Jake Ferguson, who are not coming off of big performances. So make sure you guys are checking your lineups and adjusting accordingly. All right, first up, we have Thursday night football. We're going to have the Broncos traveling to face the Saints. And Bo Nix, at the time I'm recording this, is the QB 12 in fantasy football. Seriously, the quarterback 12. Now, that might change because I have to record these before Monday Night Football, but still. For what it's worth, he has 19 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 matchups in a very down game against the Jets in Week 4, just 6.7 fantasy points. So maybe those of you guys in Superflex, double quarterback leagues, you will have opportunities to potentially start Bo Nix. Like in Week 8, he gets the Carolina Panthers. May not be a bad start, but he's on the road in Weeks 9 and 10 against the Ravens and Chiefs. So, you know, Bo Nix is starting to do some stuff in his rookie season. 216 passing yards in Week 6, 2 touchdowns, a pick, 61 yards on the ground, 21.7 fantasy points after having 23 fantasy points against the Raiders in Week 5. But here on a short week against the Saints defense, who I know was not so great last week, but overall on the season has been pretty dang good, I'm not going to say that we should go out and start Bo Nix. You'd have to be desperate in a double quarterback super flex format to consider starting Bo Nix, but certainly worth keeping an eye on as he continues to progress in his rookie season. He might be a player that we can stream at times. In terms of the Broncos tight ends, there's just nobody. I mean, this offense would definitely benefit from, correct usage of a tight end or a star tight end type player. We look back to last week, Lucas Krull, 4 targets and 2 receptions and 3 fantasy points was your most targeted or active tight end. You got Greg Dulcich, Adam Trotman, and Nate Atkins doing nothing. So nothing of fantasy relevance in terms of Broncos tight ends. Now we move along to the Saints. We've got another rookie quarterback starting here, and that is Spencer Rattler in the wake of an injury to Derek Carr, and he got his first rookie start last week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And, I don't want to say Spencer Rattler was particularly bad, but he wasn't also particularly good. 22 of 40, 243 passing yards, threw a touchdown, threw 2 interceptions, and had 27 yards rushing. He did fumble once, although it was not a lost fumble. So 14 fantasy points. Once again, good defense in the Broncos. I know Pat Surtain has the concussion and everything, but this is still a good defense with or without Pat Surtain. And I think you'd only be considering Rattler if you're in a super flex or double quarterback format once again, maybe outside of like deep dynasty leagues. So Rattler is going to be a sit for me. I hate Thursday night matchups, good defenses, short week. Don't have any interest here, but we'll see how he does in his second career start. And yeah, we got plenty of options at tight end when it comes to the Saints tight end room, but you just never know what you're going to get. I will say, if Taysom Hill is active this week, maybe you could roll out Taysom Hill because of the injury to Carr, and maybe they want to get Taysom Hill more involved. So that's one thing, but Foster Moreau, 7.4 points in week 6. Jawan Johnson, 7.8 points in week 6. Sure, maybe you can spot play those guys if you're desperate, but I just hate the Saints tight end room from a fantasy perspective. Way too volatile, way too inconsistent. I don't personally trust them at all or have any interest in starting them in week 7. All right, moving along to Sunday. Our first game of the week will be the last London game of the year, and that's going to be the Patriots facing off against the Jaguars. And Drake May looking pretty okay in his first start in his rookie season. 21.5 fantasy points, 20 of 33, 243 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 2 picks, a lost fumble, some turnovers, 5 rushing attempts for 38 rushing yards. Now, maybe it's unfair to say that we can play Drake May this week, but not play Bo Nix. But I think it's fair because this is the Jaguars. This is the worst defense in the entire NFL. This is a team that opposing quarterbacks put up points against. So 21 fantasy points against the Texans. If you are desperate, you need a streaming option, I'll take a chance on Drake May this week, but I'd maybe tamper the expectations of a high ceiling. But yeah, I think Drake May is streamable. And, I do worry about Hunter Henry, who's looking like a streaming option again, because after he had the big week in week 2, I told all you guys, I don't trust Hunter Henry. He does this. He pops up. Then he has 5 or less fantasy points for 3 weeks, and he pops up again. That's exactly what has happened here. But he did have a touchdown last week. He had 5 targets, 3 receptions, 41 receiving yards, 13 fantasy points. But once again, it's the Jaguars. If you're in need of a tight end play, he's just 25% rostered. Drake May is 15% rostered. They are both startable this week due to the matchup against the Jaguars. On the other hand, speaking of the Jaguars, I have no interest whatsoever starting Trevor Lawrence. I mean, he did have 18 fantasy points last week, 23 of 35, 234 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, a pick, 17 yards on the ground. And, the one benefit of this defense being so bad in terms of the Jaguars from a fantasy perspective is that they are consistently needing to throw the football, which I guess is good for Trevor Lawrence, but it's not the worst matchup. This Patriots defense certainly hasn't been very inspiring as of late. Sure, T-Law's, I guess, always in that streaming area. He can always put up some points, or he can have 14 or less points like he did the first 4 weeks of the season. I mean, he's played the Colts and the Bears in the past 2 weeks, and last week they did nothing but throw because they were behind the entire game. So I just have no interest in starting Trevor Lawrence from a fantasy perspective right now. Looking at the tight end position, I think Brenton Strange, one of my favorite streaming options early in the season, the Strange man, is going back to our benches for the most part. He's going to be a sit because Evan Ingram, in his first start back since he got hurt in week 1, 18.2 fantasy points, 10 targets, 10 receptions, 102 receiving yards. Did have a fumble that was lost, but who cares? He had an incredible amount of targets, and the Bears were a top 10 team against the tight end position going into this matchup. It's going to be interesting to see if this impacts Brian Thomas Jr. or Christian Kirk's overall volume, but we know that Trevor Lawrence and Evan Ingram have a great chemistry and connection. He's going to be a must-start tight end until further notice. All right, moving into Sunday's afternoon games, we have the Lions traveling to face the Vikings in what will be one of the better games of Sunday. And I just don't think we can bench any Lions offensive player right now. Jared Goff, 25 or more fantasy points in his last 2 games. He's been very solid after kind of a slow start to the season and a lot of matchups where this team was just primarily running the football, but they have found a lot of ways to get creative as of late. This is one of the best offenses in the league. And Goff is a start. Now, you might have another option at quarterback that maybe has more upside, maybe you feel better about. That's fine. You don't have to start Goff this week, but he's been very good the past 2 weeks, and that's definitely encouraging. And the Vikings are giving up a lot of passing yards. They're a good team in terms of their front 7, stopping the run, getting sacks. But overall, Goff is going to be startable for sure in this matchup. He's been great the last 2 weeks. Sam Laporta has been a guy who I've encouraged you guys just to keep rolling with and roll with the punches, and finally kind of paid off. I mean, I know he only had 1 target, 1 reception last week, but 52 receiving yards and a touchdown was certainly nice to see. 12.2 fantasy points, his first double-digit performance on the season so far. I'm expecting points in this game. I'm expecting some fireworks. Laporta stays in starting lineups, and tight ends are so bad lately. I mean, what are you going to do if you own Laporta? Anyways. All right, the Vikings were on bye last week, but Sam Darnold is going to be a strong start in this matchup once again. This is a good Lions defense. They looked very good last week. They've been good against the run, but they've been a little bit weaker overall in the season. I know their secondary's been better the past 2 weeks, especially last week, but overall in the season, they're allowing a good amount of passing yards. And Sam Darnold, I just think a tough player to bench. He's going to be a start here in week 7 for me. And even if it's a little bit rough, I know it's a little bit rough in week 5, of course, a bad performance for Darnold fantasy-wise with just 5.2 fantasy points. But don't, move on from Sam Darnold because he gets the Rams, the Colts, the Jaguars in the following 3 weeks after this big divisional matchup here against the Lions in week 7. So I do like Darnold this week. I think he's a solid start. We'll see when TJ Hawkinson does return. He's been spotted at practice. If he's active in this game, well, then we could consider Hawkinson, but I don't think he's going to be quite ready, which leaves us to just Johnny Munt, my guy, the legend himself, Johnny Munt. 7.2 or less fantasy points so far on the season. Not going to be a start, unfortunately, but for the most part, we have some very viable fantasy options in this week 7 matchup. Next up, we will have the Titans traveling to face the Bills, and there is no way in God's green earth that I would ever start Will Levis in a fantasy matchup. He has a turnover in every game on the season so far. He has 2 turnovers in 3 out of 5 games so far on the season. Titans have their bye week in week 5. He has 3 turnovers in 2 out of 5 games on the season. We're not starting Will Levis anytime soon. On the other hand, in terms of tight ends for this team, we got a little bit of Chicken Conquo, I guess a little bit of Josh Weil as well. I have no interest in starting any pass catchers on this offense. So Chicken Conquo, Josh Weil sits. As a reminder, I have to record these videos before Monday Night Football has been played, so don't quite know how Josh Allen looks tonight against the Jets. I'm assuming it's going to be okay at worst. It is a tough matchup here. Could be a little bit of a gross game. We'll find out. But I think Allen is definitely startable against the Titans, so I know the Bills are kind of in a weird place right now. It's a tough matchup in week 6 against the Jets, but this is still Josh Allen. Still has a ceiling of 31 fantasy points so far on the season. The Titans, kind of one of these wishy-washy defenses, good against the run, but sometimes good against the pass, sometimes not. So I think Allen is okay. It's going to be interesting because you got James Cook banged up, Khalil Shakir banged up, all of that stuff, and maybe that bleeds in to week 7. Maybe it doesn't, even if those guys are active or not active. Are they close to 100%? Those are 2 very important players for this offense. So all that said, Josh Allen's Josh Allen. I think you can start him. Dalton Kincaid is still going to be in the start category for me because it's so thin at the tight end position that basically if you own Kincaid, you just roll with the punches, right? Dawson Knox, very, very minimal involvement so far on the year in this offense, so he's just going to be a sit for me as we approach week 7. All right, next up we have the Dolphins traveling to face the Colts, and I'm just going to go ahead and sit Tyler Huntley, who has no more than 11.8 fantasy points in his first 2 starts with the Dolphins in the absence of Tua Tagovailoa. Unless, Tua does come back this year, which there are reports indicating that he will. I am in no way interested in starting any other Dolphins quarterback this year. Johnny Smith, however, did some things in week 5 as the Dolphins had a bye week in week 6. 11.1 fantasy points, 8 targets, 5 receptions, 62 receiving yards. Decent matchup here. The Colts defense pretty bad overall. There could definitely be some opportunities for the Dolphins offense against the Colts, but I just don't want to find out in my starting lineup, so Johnny Smith will be a sit. Now, interesting conundrum here. We've got Joe Flacco getting the late start in week 6. He's a streaming candidate for me if he gets to start. But now we have reports saying that Anthony Richardson with that oblique injury will get the start, barring any setbacks this week. So If A-Rich sits, does not play, then I think Flacco's streamable, but, we got to tamper our expectations. I even said that last week. The Tennessee Titans defense might not be great, but they're not as bad as the Jaguars. He's probably not going to have 26 fantasy points again. And this Dolphins defense, very poor against the run, but they're certainly not the worst defense out there. So Flacco's streamable. And maybe it's unfair to say Anthony Richardson is a sit, but coming off the injury, 3 straight games with 12 or less fantasy points, you're probably in a position where you're already used to starting somebody who's not Anthony Richardson at the quarterback position. So I just don't think you need to go out of your way to start Anthony Richardson in his first game back. Let's go ahead and see how things look and then make a decision from there. But I'm just not there with starting A-Rich in his first game back from injury. Tight ends for the Colts are just an absolute mess. Drew Ogletree got the most volume in week 6. You've had Mo Alley Cox do some things. He actually had the most volume. That's my mistake. 4 targets, 4 receptions, 8.1 fantasy points in week 6. Joe Flacco does like to kind of target Mo Alley Cox. Drew Ogletree had the second most volume, but yeah, it's just gross here. You got Kylan Granson, Will Mallory, Drew Ogletree, and Mo Alley Cox, and none of them are really fantasy relevant. So we're going to go ahead and sit all Colts tight ends. So for the most part, for the quarterback and tight end position, I'm staying away from this matchup between the Dolphins and the Colts. All right, next up we have the Seahawks traveling to face the Falcons. And I do like this matchup in terms of a good game script. And I think that Geno Smith is going to have a solid outing. Now, disappointing in week 6 against the Niners. He's thrown for 284 or more passing yards in every game on the year except for week 1 against Denver. He has at least 1 touchdown in every game on the year, but he has also thrown 5 interceptions since week 3. So Geno's been very up and down. He's had some highs, he's had some lows, he's had some in-between games. I think Geno's startable here because I like the game script. Now, I know the Falcons defense has had some good games. But they've also had some games where they've given up a lot of points, including that week 5 matchup against the Bucs. So the Seahawks, they've had some good games defensively, but they've also had a lot of games where they're giving up a lot of points and allowing for good game scripts. So I'm going to expect some offense in this game. I think Geno Smith is a solid start going into the week. Maybe you could put him more in like the streaming category, but I think he's going to be good enough to come through with a solid fantasy day, even if it's only 17 or 18 fantasy points. And I love the current line on Underdog for Geno Smith's passing yards sitting at just 260.5. So he just needs 261 total passing yards. And like I said, he has hit that in every game this year except for week 1 against Denver. So I would head straight to Underdog, hit the higher on Geno Smith's total passing yards. And don't forget, new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch are going to get that free pick 'em for the week. Take your free pick 'em, pair it with Geno Smith's over on the passing yards, and automatically triple your cash entry. And while you're doing so, Underdog is going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. Moving along to Noah Fant. I know he had a good game in week 6. 12.3 fantasy points, 6 targets, 6 receptions, and 63 total receiving yards. But I just don't trust Noah Fant. He's like Hunter Henry, right? Noah Fant on the season, fantasy stat lines, 3.1, 2.4, 12, 4.6, 5.4, 12.3. Going by the pattern, he's going to have like 3, 4, or 5 fantasy points. I mean, sure, you're absolutely desperate. You need some points. You need the potential for 10-plus points. Fant might get you there, but for majority of you guys, I don't want to risk it. I'm not starting him. Moving along to the Falcons. Kirk O'Chains came back to earth in week 6 with just 12.5 fantasy points after the massive performance in week 5 with 35.3 fantasy points. And once again, I like this game script here. I did like Cousins going into last week, but I also talked about it throughout the week, like being a little bit afraid that The Falcons may end up just running the football the whole game or majority of the game, and that's kind of what happened. Cousins is startable because I think we're going to get a good game script, but I don't know how high the ceiling is for Kirk Cousins on a weekly basis. We'll see how it looks this week. Kyle Pitts has 10 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts. At the time I'm recording this, he is the tight end 7 on the season. We will take that. With how bad tight ends have been for majority of the season, although they were pretty good in week 6, we will take that. If you own Kyle Pitts, just roll with the punches for now. He's a good enough start here in week 7. Moving along to another exciting matchup, we have the Texans traveling to face the Packers. And CJ Stroud, you just start him every week. You take what you can get. I know it's been a little bit of an up and down season for Stroud. 18 fantasy points, 14, 11.8, 23.5, 16.9, 19.3. In week 6, 20 of 31, 192 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, 1 pick, and 7 total rushing yards. Nico Collins is out. Didn't really matter. We got Tank Dell. We got Stephon Diggs. We got Joe Mixon back. I mean, this is still a great offense. The Packers defense is good, but they also allow a lot of total passing yards and a lot of yards to the wide receiver position, even if they get those takeaways. So CJ Stroud is still in line to be a solid start. Now, I think Dalton Schultz is still in that streamable category, but that's at best, right? I mean, 8 targets, 4 receptions, 27 receiving yards, 6.7 fantasy points with no Nico Collins. No touchdowns on the year so far for Dalton Schultz, where he's had, he had 5 last year and had 5 or more for the previous 3 years, 2 of those with Dallas. But Schultz is just, you're desperate. You need some points from the tight end position. I think you can go ahead and plug him in, but don't go out of your way to do so and expect a high ceiling. Moving along to the Packers, Jordan Love, another good fantasy day, 26 fantasy points in week 6, 22 of 32, 258 passing yards, 4 touchdowns, a interception, and 13 yards on the ground. This team is throwing the football. They're putting up points. Got a lot of wide receivers on this team. They're going to spread the wealth. Josh Jacobs is going to get involved. Jordan Love is just going to say, screw it, I'll throw it up to someone, whoever's there. Hopefully they make the catch. You get a little bit of Brett Favre out of Jordan Love. You get a little bit of Aaron Rodgers out of Jordan Love. He's fun to watch. This is going to be a good matchup against the Texans. The Packers are going to need to throw the football. He is a solid start moving into the week. If you own Jordan Love, don't think you're going to consider benching him anyways. And I also love Jordan Love's total passing yards on Underdog, sitting at 257.5 at the time I'm recording this. He has hit that in every game on the year except for week 5 against the Rams. Make sure you guys go ahead and smash his over. And I don't hate CJ Stroud sitting at 249.5. And like I said earlier, new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch are going to get that free pick 'em for the week. Take your free pick 'em, hit the over on Jordan Love's total passing yards, automatically triple your cash entry. And while you're at it, Underdog's going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. And that brings us to Tucker Kraft, one of the most popular waiver wire additions at tight end over the past 2 weeks or so. And he came back to earth with 3.5 fantasy points, 4 targets, 2 receptions, 13 receiving yards in week 6. And I was high on Tucker Kraft. I like Tucker Kraft, but I also did warn you guys, we take away the touchdowns in the last 2 games against Minnesota and the LA Rams. What exactly are we left with? We still need to proceed with some caution. So I do think Kraft is definitely startable and a good start, but we also need to kind of tamper our expectations. I do like this game script, though. I'm expecting points to be scored. I'm expecting a lot of passing of the football. So I do like Tucker Kraft in this matchup. But if I didn't exactly like the game script, then I think we'd be looking at some volatility here with Tucker Kraft. And maybe we need to look closer at each specific matchup. But for the most part, Kraft is going to remain a start as he gets the Jaguars in week 8. So if you own Kraft, unless you have a better option, you can continue to roll with the punches and start Tucker Kraft. All right, next up we have the Bengals traveling to face the Browns, and tale of 2 stories with these quarterback and tight ends on these teams. But Joe Burrow, a solid start every single week. He has 17 or more fantasy points every game of the year, except for week 1 against the Pats. And he's just going to be a solid start. Higgins is out there. Chase is out there. The run game's fine. Even with Zach Moss banged up, Chase Brown is balling out. The offensive line sucks, and this team is probably wasting the talent of a generational quarterback. But from a fantasy perspective, Joe Burrow should remain fine. And this Browns defense does not scare me in any way whatsoever. So, yes, Joe Burrow, a weekly start. Mike Gesicki, 0 targets in week 6. He's just a sit for me. Was looking like he could be a streaming candidate early in the season, and now he doesn't look that way. I guess I should also mention Eric All, but I just don't trust him as well. Just 3 fantasy points in week 6. So don't want to start any Bengals tight ends, but Burrow, an obvious must start. And then we have the worst quarterback in the entire league, who is set to remain a starter for the next 2 years and is not getting benched. I don't have any of the stats in front of me, but there are some wild stats on Deshaun Watson displaying how poor his quarterback play has been this year. Watson's a sit. We don't even need to break it down. 8.4 fantasy points in his last 2 starts. So he managed to not turn the football over in week 6 against the Eagles. So that was a plus. He still sucks, though. Now, David Njoku, I do think is startable. He had 5 catches off of 7 targets this past week, 8.1 fantasy points, 31 receiving yards. I would try, if possible, to stray away from the Browns' passing attack and their offense as a whole. But if you need to start David Njoku, I do think he's startable here in week 7. All right, next up we have the Eagles traveling to face the Giants. Jalen Hurts coming back to life, coming off the bye week in week 5 and week 6 with 21.8 fantasy points, 16 to 25, 264 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 1 to A.J. Brown, 1 to Devonta Smith, both of them returning from injury, 33 yards on the ground. Now, this Giants defense is nothing to sneeze at, that's for sure, but Hurts is definitely still a solid start going into the week, and I still am of the belief if you own Jalen Hurts, you just start him until further notice. I know it's been a rough start to the year, but I think Hurts will be okay. Now, Dallas Goedert, on the other hand, is dealing with a hamstring injury. He might not play. If he does not play, well, then you can't start him. If he does play, I think you go ahead and you roll with Dallas Goedert. But we have Grant Calcaterra, who had 10.7 fantasy points in week 6 against the Browns, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 67 receiving yards in the absence of Dallas Goedert. So I've got him as a sit, but if you were absolutely desperate, I think you could plug him in if Goddard sits and probably walk away with some points, but I would do so with pretty high caution. Now, Daniel Jones, on the other hand, came back to earth in week 6. He had 18 or more fantasy points in every start but 2 through the first 5 weeks of the season. Now he has 18 or more fantasy points in 3 out of 6 starts on the season. So didn't throw a touchdown last week against the Bengals, didn't run for a touchdown, just threw an interception, 205 passing yards, 56 yards on the ground, 12.8 fantasy points, struggled in this matchup. The Giants should presumably get Malik Neighbors back here in week 7, which should help this passing attack. And the Eagles secondary looked a little bit better last week, but that was against the Browns, so I don't know how much we want to read into that. Overall, this has been a pretty poor pass defense for the Eagles. So I think if you're desperate, you could roll with Daniel Jones and hope he has one of these 18, 19, 20 fantasy points days. But once again, proceed with caution. Theo Johnson, 6 fantasy points last week, 9.8 in week 5. Probably not going to start him anytime soon. You'd have to be like deep in a dynasty league and all your tight ends are hurt and you just need a couple points. Outside of that, let's sit Theo Johnson in week 7. Next up, we have the Raiders traveling to face the Rams, and boy, oh boy, what a gross matchup. Aiden O'Connell got the start in week 6. He was 27 of 40, 227 passing yards, a touchdown and a pick, 12 fantasy points. No, thank you. Let's just stay far away from this Raiders quarterback situation. We don't want to stay far away from Brock Bowers, though. 16.1 fantasy points in week 6, 10 targets, 9 receptions, 71 receiving yards, the most targets of any tight end on the season so far. He's balling out. It's a great matchup. The The Raiders don't have a lot of other options in terms of pass catchers. Jacoby Myers has been banged up. Devontae Adams nursing that hamstring. All that stuff. Bowers, regardless of what's going on, is a great start, and we are starting him until further notice. In terms of the Rams, Matthew Stafford has been dealing with a back injury, which is the last thing you want to hear if you're a Rams fan or, a Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp owner or Kyron Williams owner. I don't know what's going on with the Rams this season, but he's not expected to miss any time, but certainly something to monitor. And Stafford's still a sit for me. He has not had more than 13 fantasy points since week 1, and he only had 15.6 fantasy points in week 1. So no Kupp is the expectation in week 7. I think there's a possibility Kupp plays is the report, but probably no Kupp, no Puka. There's some other playmakers on this team. Don't get me wrong. Stafford, maybe you could stream if you were desperate, just because it's the Raiders and this defense is awful. But I would still rather start Daniel Jones than Matthew Stafford this week. Colby Parkinson in his last start in week 5 as the Rams were on bye week in week 6 had 12.2 fantasy points, 7 receptions off of 13 targets. Maybe he could also be in the streaming category. I'm just trying to distance myself as much as I can from this Rams offense outside of Kyron Williams at the moment. So decent matchup here for Stafford and Colby Parkinson. If you're desperate enough, sure, we can stream them, but for the most part, I'm going to have them as a sit moving into week 7. Next up, we have the Panthers traveling to face the Commanders. 16.9 fantasy points for Andy Dalton in week 6, 26-38, 221 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 picks, 21 yards on the ground. I got him in the streaming category, but once again, only if you're desperate. I think 16, 17, 18 fantasy points is definitely doable for Andy Dalton against the Commanders defense and their secondary. I also think a bad game is possible for Andy Dalton. I don't think there's going to be much of an in-between for the Commanders defense this week. I think they're either going to show up and, force some interceptions on Andy Dalton, or maybe they'll allow a decent game to Andy Dalton. So he's streamable, but definitely not my favorite stream. But, we got 2 bye weeks this week. We've had some injuries, so trying to give you guys some more options. Jatavion Sanders did have 9.9 fantasy points, 7 targets, 5 receptions, 49 receiving yards last week. But, yeah, I'm not going to start a Panthers tight end. Tommy Tremble was out with a concussion last week. Don't have any interest in starting a Panthers tight end anytime soon. Do have plenty of interest in continuing to start Jaden Daniels, who has 20 or more fantasy points in every game this year except for week 2 against the Giants. He is the quarterback 3 in fantasy at the time I'm recording this. Don't need to break it down. 24-35 last week against the Ravens, 269 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 22 yards on the ground, 20.9 fantasy points in week 6. He's been incredible. He's been great. If you own him, don't think about it. Just leave him in your starting lineup. Zach Ertz, one of my favorite streaming options going into week 6 as the Ravens have struggled against the tight end position. Had 10 fantasy points, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 68 receiving yards. He gets another good matchup against the Panthers this week, who have also struggled against the tight end position. So Ertz sits at just 36% rostered. I think he's a solid streaming option this week and overall a good start. So you need help at tight end. Zach Ertz is a very good option moving into week 7. Next up, we have a rematch of last year's Super Bowl, and that's going to be the Chiefs traveling to face the Niners in what should be a good matchup. I'm expecting some points here. I'm going to say you can start Patrick Mahomes. If you own Patrick Mahomes, you probably have another option on your roster. You want to go with that other option? Fine. You still only had 14.4 fantasy points in week 5. The offense looked fine against the Saints, but the run game was really good. Rushing touchdown to Xavier Worthy. Mahomes only has more than 16 fantasy points in one game on the year, and in that game, in week 3, he had 17.3 fantasy points. So, this Niners defense doesn't exactly scare me, but Mahomes doesn't exactly excite me at the same time. So, he's definitely startable, but I'm still a little concerned if I'm a Mahomes owner. Don't forget, in week 5, I basically told you guys that Mahomes was a sit for me. We'll see what happens here. Kelsey, I do think, is a solid start. He's definitely come back to life in the absence of Rashee Rice and other injuries to this offensive roster. So 15.9 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts. The Chiefs on bye week in week 6. You own Kelsey. Continue to start him. They need him. He's going to get that volume. He's going to continue to be a solid start. Noah Gray, on the other hand, probably not a solid start. 4.9 fantasy points in his last start in week 5 against the Saints. Might at times get more volume with the injuries to this team, but I don't think we need to start Noah Gray anytime soon. Looking at the Niners, Brock Purdy continues to be one of these quarterbacks that you just start. You take what you can get. You might get 15 points. You might get 24 points. Those are his last 2 stat lines, But you just take what you can get. He's a top 10 quarterback in fantasy scoring. Was 18 of 28 this past week on Thursday Night Football against the Seahawks. 255 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, a very solid performance. 19 rushing yards, 24.1 fantasy points. Continue to start Purdy and roll with the punches. George Kittle's your tight end 1 in fantasy football. So far, he has played in 5 games on the season. And so far, he has 5 touchdowns on the season. He has 4 touchdowns in his last 3 starts. He has been very good, to say the least. Like I said, the tight end 1 so far on the year. 6 targets, 5 receptions, 58 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, and 22.8 fantasy points in week 6. So it's a tough matchup against the Chiefs, but yeah, if you own Kittle, you're not benching Kittle anytime soon. Next up, we have the Jets traveling to face the Steelers. And as a reminder, I have to record these early on Monday, so don't know exactly how A-Rod has looked in Monday Night Football. I'm going to assume he's going to be around that 15, 16-point place he's been for most of the season. And this is a tough matchup on the road against the Steelers. So, I don't think anyone's really in a position where they have to start Aaron Rodgers, so I'm just going to leave him as a sit. I think Tyler Conklin is a streamable player this week, especially if he has a good outing in Monday Night Football. If he doesn't, then maybe looks to some other options like Zach Ertz per se. But Conklin could be okay. We'll just leave it at that. Not my favorite, but he does have double digits in at least 2 of his last 3 matchups at the time I'm recording this. So he's streamable, but he's kind of like a Noah Fant, Kate Otten, shows up, disappears. Do we really want to trust it? Now, I have Justin Fields, on the other hand, for the Steelers as a start. He has 15 or more fantasy points in his last 4 games with a ceiling of 31.9 fantasy points, 23.7 fantasy points against the Raiders in week 6. Was 14 of 24, 145 passing yards. Didn't do a lot through the air, but 11 rushing attempts for 59 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. So it's never pretty when Fields is your starting quarterback. You don't even want to watch the games. Then you check your lineup at the end of the game and you have some fantasy points, So the Raiders, though, a very poor defense. The Jets, not nearly as poor of a defense, but they have, compared, to the passing game, they've struggled more in terms of the defending the run game on the season as a whole. So maybe some opportunities for Fields in this game. We'll see. What worries me more is the rest of this offense for the Steelers is still just not really clicking, and the receivers aren't that great. So Fields is definitely startable, but it depends on who else you have on your roster. Pat Freiermuth is in that streaming category. Take what you can get if you own him. Start another tight end if you have another one who has a better matchup. If you don't, then just roll with the punches. Not a fantastic matchup here. 3.6 fantasy points in week 6. A touchdown that was called back because Fields was over the line of scrimmage. Or else he would have had 3 touchdowns in 3 straight games. So I still like Freiermuth, but he's still just in the streaming category as we approach week 7. Moving along to Monday, we have 2 Monday night matchups. Let's start with the Ravens traveling to face the Buccaneers. This should be an exciting game. Plenty of points. Lamar Jackson has been an absolute stud. He's the quarterback 1 in fantasy football. 17 or more fantasy points every matchup on the year. 23 or more fantasy points in 4 out of 6 matchups. 20 of 26, 323 passing yards, a touchdown, a pick, 40 yards on the ground against the Commanders in week 6. He's a start every week. Doesn't matter. You own him. You play him. Mark Andrews, I think, is creeping back up into the start category as he has had 9.5 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts, a touchdown against the Commanders, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 66 receiving yards. Let's just say if you own Mark Andrews, you don't have anything else, we'll roll with the punches. That's my saying for today's video, apparently. So Andrews is fine, but still some volatility. Isaiah Likely, this was the issue with week 5. 3 targets, 3 receptions. 2 of those receptions were touchdowns. So he didn't do a whole lot. He just scored twice. And then he had 4.7 fantasy points in week 6. So, yeah, just way too volatile. All over the place. The volume's super low. We haven't seen that usage that we saw in week 1 since week 1. So he'll probably pop off for 19 fantasy points this week because no one's going to start him. But let's just stay away from that situation. Baker Moneymaker Mayfield, a guy I talked a lot about in the offseason, got made fun of a lot in the offseason as one of my favorite quarterbacks to draft. And Baker is the QB2 in fantasy. I just don't think we can bench Baker. Like, I will admit, going into week 6, there are other quarterbacks that I told you guys I liked more than Baker. I didn't particularly like the matchup against the Saints on the road. He did throw 3 picks. He also threw 4 touchdowns and 325 passing yards and ran for 29 rushing yards and had 28.9 fantasy points, which was his second best mark on the season. So I just don't think we can bench Baker. He's in that area now where he's playing lights out. This offense is clicking. The run game is insane. You got Evans, who I know doesn't play well against the Saints as we expected, but he's still Mike Evans. We got Chris Godwin absolutely balling out. Cade Otton has looked good. Sterling Shepard is contributing to this offense. Baker is a start against the Ravens here in week 7. Now, Cade Otton, like I said, is definitely a streamable option. 7.4 or more fantasy points in his last 4 starts. Scored a touchdown this past week. 6 targets, 2 receptions, and 15 receiving yards for 9.5 total fantasy points. The Ravens have struggled against the tight end position, so if Cade Otton's out there sitting at 42% rostered, I do think he is a strong stream in what should be a good game script and a good matchup here in week 7. Final game of the week is going to be the Chargers traveling to face the Cardinals, and this is an interesting one, but let's start with the Chargers. So Justin Herbert has just been a sit for me all year long. This is not going to be a fantasy-relevant quarterback, okay? This is a run-first team, a run-first offense. They want to play defense. They want to play smash-mouth football. They want to run the football. Herbert is just not going to have that fantasy value. He's going to throw a touchdown or 2 here and there. The last game he threw 2 touchdowns against the Panthers. He only had 12 fantasy points. He also had a lost fumble and a pick in that game, but still, we just can't trust Justin Herbert from a fantasy perspective. He's had 2 injuries since the offseason. It's a good matchup against the Cardinals, but I have no interest in starting Herbert anytime soon. I also have no interest in starting any Chargers tight ends. In a deep dynasty league last week, where all my tight ends were either on bye week or injured, I did have to pick up Will Dissly and start him. And I did win that matchup. He had 5 targets, 4 receptions, 26 receiving yards, and 6.6 fantasy points. That is the type of circumstance you would have to be in to pick up a Chargers tight end and play them. So, no interest in starting a Chargers tight end here in week 7. All right, looking at the Cardinals, I am a little worried about Kyler Murray. I don't love this matchup. Marvin Harrison Jr. might not play. We definitely need to monitor his health. He's a key factor for me in starting Kyler Murray this week. I don't quite think we can just say start Kyler Murray every week. Since week 1, 14.1, 28.5, 15.7, 9.9, 25.1, 11.9. Those are his fantasy stat lines. This offense looked very stale last week for the most part. He was 22 of 32, 214 passing yards, had a passing touchdown, ran the ball 7 times for 14 total yards. So something just seems off here. I like this Chargers defense. They looked really good for a majority of the game against the Broncos, and they bent a little bit there in the fourth quarter, but I just feel kind of iffy. Kyler also has a turnover in 3 of the last 4 games, whether it was an interception or a lost fumble. So I'm a little iffy on Kyler. It depends on what else you have, but if you have nothing better, we do know that he has a ceiling of 28 fantasy points so far on the year, and he can always pop. But I'm a little worried about this Cardinals offense, especially if Marvin Harrison Jr. is out. Now, the one part of this offense that has not been stale outside of James Conner for a majority of the season is Trey McBride, who's your tight end 6 at the time I'm recording this. He had 17.6 fantasy points in week 6, 8 targets, 8 receptions, 96 receiving yards. You own Trey McBride. You start him every single week as long as he's healthy. Going to be a little bit of volatility here, but the tight end position, I mean, for the most part, that's just what we're getting here in 2024. McBride is a solid start moving into week 7. And that'll do it for today's video. There's every single quarterback, every single tight end, every single matchup, and who you should be starting or sitting. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. If you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 7 of the season, drop me a comment. I'll answer every single comment before Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. And don't forget, as the week goes on, we're going to have every single thing you could possibly need here on the channel to help you guys bring home a dub. Start sits at every position, must start defenses, kicker rankings, buy low targets, players that are going to go nuclear this week, players that are sneaky starts, last minute waiver wire additions, live fantasy Q&A streams, all kinds of content. Make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.